When I win, he's going to send me where she's been hiding all these years. And this time, I'm going to finish what I started.
Billboards.
Previously in this retrospective series, we had discussed all of the Twisted Metal games up to 2005. Twisted Metal Black and Head On were the two games that firmly planted the franchise's rightful owners into its holy soil. If you haven't watched the two previous videos of this retrospective, I suggest you go back and do so. With that said, let's look into the later years of this series with the co-creator David Jaffe himself. It wouldn't be 7 years until we'd see a true blue Twisted Metal installment after Head On. While just about all Twisted Metal fans are certainly aware of the 2012 title on PlayStation 3, let's take a look into the franchise's quieter history before getting into its last big entry thus far. The franchise wasn't completely dormant, but there's multiple reasons why this hiatus was so long for Twisted Metal. As Twisted Metal Black was finishing production, David separated from Incognito in order to work on God of War for PlayStation 2 within Santa Monica Studios. With Jaffe dedicating his entire time to this upcoming hit, a faction of developers within Incognito went forward with an idea known as War of the Monsters, an action brawler based on classic movie monsters. With that, Scott Campbell, co-creator of Twisted Metal, still hanging with Incognito, was left to his own devices to plan a new Twisted Metal game as a continuation to Black, while their B team would begin work on War of the Monsters. Twisted Metal Harbor City, as it was internally dubbed, made great progress at the time and was shaping up to be a very ambitious installment, at least from a single-player standpoint. Sadly, the game was ultimately cancelled and never even got an official announcement before this happened.
I'm assuming what happened was Harbor City had no choice but to shut down. In fact, we did Calling All Cars before we started Eat, Sleep, Play. And I think maybe what happened is I said, hey, let's make Calling All Cars. And maybe Scott was like, this is the new team. Jaffe's on the new team. I want to work on what he wants to work on. I mean, I'm just guessing at this point because I wasn't working on Harbor City.
In fact, there was little to no information about this game at all until they included much of its salvage content as bonus features for the PlayStation 2 port of Twisted Metal Head On. For this cancelled installment, Sweet Tooth would have been the main character with an adventure mode, leaving the vehicle at times to traverse through stages in order to take on platforming or even combat challenges. Just like a lot of games around this time, they wanted to take a crack at the Grand Theft Auto formula. Twisted Metal with open world mechanics and on-foot challenges. Still strange to think about. However, it looks like this portion of the game was being saved for the end of production, as it appears only the car combat portion was the most finished, according to what dedicated fans that managed to snatch up some early builds have shown. That makes sense. The people at Incognito were most familiar with vehicular combat gameplay design, so might as well get the easier stuff out of the way. This game would have a world where all the stages intertwined rather than being designed as separate pieces for the tournament, similar to a concept the team had with the very first Twisted Metal game. And from how this prototype is presented, it appears that all the drivers from Black would return, but I think this was just for the sake of character variety while you give this unfinished game a try. And I doubt they wanted to design and render new vehicle entries for the sake of this abandoned piece. Well, more than one, that is.
The only thing I had to do with Head On was when we started Eat, Sleep, Play, and we did sort of the extra Twisted Edition for PS2. And I did the retrofitting the levels for the Lost series on that game. I created some new characters like Six Pack and things like that.
Unfortunately, Jaffe cannot discuss development since he was not involved in this game's production before cancellation. Still, I sincerely doubt every one of the characters would have returned, especially considering these descriptions feel like they were made up on the spot. They're also really goofy compared to the stories presented in the original Twisted Metal Black. But who knows, perhaps these were part of a draft from whomever the writer was going to be. Jaffe has already talked about the sinister nature of Twisted Metal Black. More likely than not, that element would have either felt non-existent or trying too hard if he wasn't there to provide his creativity. All we have left are 2 playable on-foot stages that feel pre-alpha at best, and 4 vehicle stages that are a little bland or don't have enough going on, but hey, it's an unfinished game. I'm not faulting anyone for this. Prototype builds showed they had other ideas for stages, such as a shopping mall, but for whatever reason they were not included in this playable state. This unfinished build of Twisted Metal Harbor City feels like Head-On's gameplay, so it doesn't have that fast-paced intensity from the original Twisted Metal Black. Considering this is the same engine, I guess that should tell me there's more to it than that. People have posited that remnants of Harbor City were worked into Head-On after getting scrapped, but nobody really knows for sure. I've actually found a lot of odd rumors here and there about what went down within Incognito around this time, and well, I don't want to spend all this time needlessly speculating. I feel like a lot of our questions would be answered if someone got to have a talk with Scott Campbell, who has put just as much into this franchise as David Jaffe. So, if anyone out there knows a way I can reach him, that'd be great. Please? After how much of an impact Twisted Metal Black left on early PlayStation 2 players back in 2001, I was sad to see that Harbor City couldn't come to fruition in order to add more to Black's world. However, discovering that David was never to be involved in the first place, and if we're to take these story descriptions for the cast to heart, maybe it's better this way. It's hard to really pinpoint what's wrong with this, but I think the world of Black is something that should be handled by the likes of Jaffe and Jenkins, since they were able to shape the world of that title so incredibly well. We've seen what happens when David doesn't lead the helm for Twisted Metal games made by the original crew. They just lean towards a more tame style.
When Scott said, "Do you want to start a company?" and I said yes, he and a bunch of people were available to do so. And I have to assume that in being available either to start a company or work on Calling All Cars, that put the stake in the heart of Twisted Metal Harbor City. And I would have to assume that if Sony wanted that game to ship, they would have said, no, you can't do that. We have to finish Harbor City. I don't know if the project wasn't going well or if the project had 2 more years of production. And Scott's like, look, I'm not sticking around for 2 years. I don't know exactly what would cause Sony to pull the plug on that game. That would be more of a question for Scott.
Not to say Harbor City would have been a bad game or even a bad Twisted Metal game. I guess I like the idea that the only true entry to this demented world is Twisted Metal Black, which is the title nearest and dearest to me. This vision remains pure and unhindered. It probably won't ever be muddled by folks that didn't understand how to dive into that world. Shortly after the cancellation of Harbor City, Twisted Metal Head-On launched. When God of War 2 began production, David took a back seat in its development as co-director so that he can briefly work with Incognito one more time to design a PSN exclusive game known as Calling All Cars, a car combat game that's much more arcadey in design and doesn't rely on you destroying opponents but rather catching crooks escaping prison. It's actually a really cute and charming game that feels good to play. A shame that it never received even a little bit of recognition. Around this time, Incognito Entertainment was knee-deep in creating Warhawk for PlayStation 3, but Scott Campbell figured this was an opportunity to separate from that company and approach Jaffe about starting their own team. Yeah, Scott wants to jump ship to join him. Again. What's so alluring about him, Scott?
I had finished God of War. Scott Campbell reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to start a company together now that you're done with God of War? And I said, yeah, that sounds great. Let's start a fucking company together. If I had to guess, it was that he was going to leave Sony Incognito, which was the company he had built and sold, and he was going to take a bunch of people with him to form Eat, Sleep, Play with me.
Thus, Eat, Sleep, Play was born. While David and Scott were working on the PlayStation 2 port of Twisted Metal Head-On, they began brainstorming on how to reintroduce the purest form of car combat. Again.
Apocalypse, and I guess I didn't think we called it Revolution, but the sort of Midnight Club Twisted Metal and Apocalypse were simply things we were exploring of what Twisted Metal could be on PlayStation 3. It wasn't that we started development and we canceled them. It was just that in the beginning process of making a new Twisted Metal, we were exploring a number of different ideas, and those were the 2 that had the most traction before we ended up sort of pulling the trigger on what this ultimate last Twisted Metal became.
2 big ideas were being played around with the most, one of them tentatively dubbed the Twisted Metal Apocalypse. Planning started to take shape around 2008 for the PlayStation 3.
We were going to look at this Twisted Metal Apocalypse version, which was kind of like more of a Mad Max take on it, where America had been devastated by nukes or whatever, and all the battlefields were sort of, destroyed around Mount Rushmore and things like that, things that you could identify.
However, only some concept art came out of this setting. Things weren't shaping up too well for the idea of an apocalyptic backdrop in Twisted Metal.
The real problem with that is Scott really wasn't a big fan of the apocalyptic theme, so he couldn't really get behind it personally. And the other part is that we struggled with the fact that part of the fun of Twisted Metal is you destroying that stuff. So if we drop you into a battleground and it's already destroyed because the story dictates that Mount Rushmore has lost a bunch of its faces, the player's going to be like, well, I want to be the guy who destroys the faces and knocks them off.
David says the idea of this wasteland of a world for Twisted Metal was something they've been kicking around since the PS2 days, but for various reasons, they kept coming to the conclusion that it isn't a good fit for Twisted Metal. And when the idea did start growing on them, Sony advised them to abandon the project altogether. This is possibly due to an upcoming title in the Sony-owned MotorStorm series already using a very similar setting. There was also a game they were working on that never got even so much as a tentative title, according to David, but they were going in a wildly surprising direction as their attempt to remake that original formula about as subversive as Twisted Metal Black was back in 2001.
There were two things we really wanted to do. I think the first thing we tried to do was really expand the brand. We wanted to make it more internationally successful. We wanted to take it out of the niche success it had been and sort of get more into mainstream game success with it. And to that end, we tried to retheme it a little bit. We started exploring this idea. I don't remember if we even had a title for it. We were just calling it Twisted Metal, but it was very much like Twisted Metal merged with like Fast and the Furious. And we're like, okay, let's make it feel more urban. Let's make it feel more not realistic cars or anything, but let's make it feel like this could actually be happening and sort of extract a large percentage of the fantasy of it and make something more like something that you could see happening, God forbid, on the streets outside your home, and building a cast of characters and a cast of vehicles that had more of a Fast and the Furious type appeal to them.
The developers described this as a Midnight Club installment to the series. Everyone was going to be designed more like sleek criminals and vigilantes rather than complete psychopaths. Here we have some character art. This guy's probably Mr. Grimm, maybe that's Agent Stone, and this guy is Slender Man?
The most striking example is like we had a new version of Sweet Tooth, which was pretty much just this normal guy, bald dude who had flame tattoos on his head and sort of gold teeth grill, and that was going to be our version of Sweet Tooth for a while. And we were going to be doing gang members and Yakuza members and CIA members, and so instead of having literally Mr. Grimm be a dude wearing a skull helmet or a personification of the Grim Reaper, they were going to basically be sort of a street gang that was well funded by Calypso Industries, and they were going to be sort of one of the teams competing to win this underground thing called Twisted Metal.
As for reasons behind its cancellation, they commented on the matter saying it was very difficult to create stages that melded with the atmosphere without being bland and boring to fight in. Just some populated city streets, you know? In other words, the design and style this potential game offered made it more difficult to make it not so flat. It's definitely easier to make racetracks out of this kind of environment than battlegrounds. David reflects that this concept is still ripe with potential, but something he felt he couldn't pursue with the people at Eat, Sleep, Play.
I still think that idea in a lot of ways could have worked. I just don't think the team was the right team for it. I don't think that they would tell you otherwise, or they would take an affront if I said that the vast majority of the guys out in Utah are not sort of really connected with street culture, racing culture. And it wasn't necessarily my scene either. I kind of came to it by way of Hollywood's take on it, but I knew enough about it that I thought we could riff on it. But it clearly wasn't a good fit. And so we were still saying, let's expand the franchise.
However, elements of this idea would be used for the last entry, as you will soon see. The head-on port bared a secret tease that they were, in fact, making a new installment for PlayStation 3. Regardless, there was no information past that for years. This made people assume that, despite the secret tease, the company was having issues getting a new game off the ground, which actually turned out to be true. It didn't help that David himself claimed he has nothing to show and would not be appearing at E3 2010 when the event was coming up. However,
It's good to be back.
In this day and age of video games, it's less common to surprise people when it comes to game announcements, so imagine my shock when I'm watching the E3 2010 stream and witness this teaser for a brand new Twisted Metal before I even realize what it is.
Where was the skill? Where was the strategy? I mean, shoot, drive, nothing.
Those games had both skill and strategy.
I remember watching this and thinking, wait, is this?
You go. Speed, strategy, skill. Those games were awesome.
No. Or is it?
You name me one car combat game that was as good on PlayStation 1, kicked ass on PlayStation 2, and kicked even more ass on PS3. The ultimate ass kicking.
Are they talking about...
That's right. You can't do it because it doesn't exist. Now get back to work, punk.
And once you see this big, beautiful bastard come in... Oh, shit! Shortly after, David Jaffe comes on stage with Scott Campbell reveling in this new announcement. That's right, he flat out lied to everyone in order to make this even less expected, thus more special when it happened.
And we're the co-founders of Eat, Sleep, Play, and we're...
A brand new Twisted Metal game for the PlayStation 3. Finally, right? Twisted Metal 2012 took David and his team about 3 years to develop. When production began, the game was planned to be a multiplayer-only title for a slight bargain price, similar to the early PlayStation 3 Warhawk game.
The thing that this game taught us is that there are really 4 types of Twisted Metal fans. There's the type that loves the stories, and that's why they show up. There's the type that loved the single player. There's the type that loved the multiplayer. And then there's the type that kind of loves the whole fucking thing. And so for us, we were under the impression that most people love Twisted Metal because the multiplayer. That was the evergreen mode. You played it forever. You played it in split screen with your friends. This could be the first out-of-the-box online Twisted Metal. Obviously, we had Black Online, but you had to get the adapter sold separately. You had to send in a code to get the disc. This was like you buy it at Walmart. It just fucking works out of the box. And so part of it was just that we said that's probably the most appealing aspect to this game, that it's like, hey, you can play Twisted Metal online for the first time. At least that would be most people's experience, because it's not like most people played the black version with the net adapter.
With Sony providing more time and money for them to develop a single-player mode that dove into multiple character stories, Twisted Metal 2012 would get one last nudge to be a full-fledged retail game. Perhaps a bit to David and the crew's detriment.
70%, 60% of the way through development, Sony came to us and said, we want to make this a $60 full retail title. Can you guys put in single player? And we were like, well, we can, but it's not going to be very satisfying. That's not what this game is. If you wanted single player, that's something that we had to build from the ground up. We had to have characters getting out of cars, and we had to build the levels to accommodate the scale of a car, not just the literal scale, but the speed scale of how the visual resolution and the modeling resolution of these environments, which if you're running by them at 100 miles an hour, you don't have to worry about every nook and cranny. Suddenly, if Sweet Tooth's getting out of the van anywhere, the resolution of those models has to be through the roof. And so we said, it's not going to be a competitive single player experience. And they're like, yeah, we understand, but we think it needs it. Marketing wants it. I don't remember the specifics of what the key was. And they said, we'll give you more time to do it, but we really want to expand the product to make it be that. And we're like, okay, that's why it ended up going down that road. It was never like our initial vision to make a single player Twisted Metal again.
This would be one of the last big exclusives for PlayStation 3 before the company moved on with their new console about a year later. Even before this, the concept of Twisted Metal 2012 had a windy road, as we just covered, so it didn't exactly rub them the right way, but they understood Sony's intent.
This is what it's going to be. Sure, you're okay with this? And they're like, we want to sell it for $60. We need to sell it for $60. It needs to be in a box. And that's not painting the marketing guys as mouth breathers. They were right. They were like, look, we're looking at the budget. We're looking at the interest from Target, Toys R Us, GameStop. We think the best business decision, even if the single player is not something that sets the world on fire, is to have a full featured retail product. and we'll give you more money to do it, even though we know that it's going to be limited in terms of the single player. And we were like, okay, because frankly, we were focused on the multiplayer and figured, okay, even if the single player is not great, it doesn't matter because people are still playing Call of Duty games where the single player campaign was just meh, but they're playing it because of the multiplayer. And that was our thinking.
An early goal David had was to make a Twisted Metal title that appealed to more people outside of the US in order for the franchise to prosper. In the end, though,
two things we wanted to do was sort of, create a wider appealing version of the IP. I don't think we did that because where we ended up was basically right back where we started with just a better next gen coat of paint in terms of sort of the world. It was incredibly well done, but it wasn't like the Europeans were suddenly going to go, oh my God, Twisted Metal, what's this? It's like, no, it still had that sort of bar band flavor to it.
I think this speaks for how important this franchise's roots are. As much as everyone involved wished for success in their projects and might be willing to go with something that can cast a wider net, David considered all the other developers and what they would actually want to create with passion. He isn't happy if they're not happy. So, as one would expect, the core gameplay remains unchanged, but everything was refined so excellently and razor sharp on PlayStation 3 hardware. While Jaffe has shared his qualms with the pace of Twisted Metal Black being too fast for players, this feels just as cranked to the max. Hey, I'm not complaining. It was unbelievable how good it felt controlling vehicles in this game, and the destructible environment is more satisfying than ever before. There were various modes to enjoy both online and offline. I'd love to show you guys some online play, but on the last few days the servers were still active, I couldn't get a damn game going. I kept getting kicked out. Okay, finally. I think we got one going after getting booted off like 4 other games. Alright, here we go.
Welcome to Team Hunted.
No, why? Here, just watch some high-level online play with someone who's probably way better at this game than me. This was something David really wanted to emphasize for this Twisted Metal, since PlayStation 3 was Sony's first home console to come with online capabilities. This is what led to extremely unique vehicle choices that had their own strong advantages and disadvantages, such as the Juggernaut, Vermin, and Talon.
The other thing that I really wanted to do on the design front was I was watching a lot of team games come to fruition, and I started to get really excited about building sort of Team Fortress 2 meets Twisted Metal and building a class-based online team game where you were able to pick certain vehicles and certain game modes based on the team you were playing with. You would have characters that were really good at playing defense and characters that could protect other characters and characters that could sort of come in really quick, do some damage and get out, but their armor wasn't very heavy. So you needed to make sure there was a healer somewhere on the periphery of that battle. And the idea of a team that really could kind of put together an interesting blend of the vehicles could really dominate.
Maybe Juggernaut wasn't the best choice for this. I was trying to use the health truck, but I kind of got stuck. I can't... Oh. This is like seeing elephants mating. I feel like I should be looking away. Honestly, I'm not sure if the Juggernaut is even able to use the health truck. But that wasn't all. Revamping the controls added even more depth to the combat. Shield, landmines, reverse firing, and freeze attacks were mapped to a single D-pad press instead of a combination, making them much simpler to dish out, but just as strategic to use as ever. Nearly all weapons of the previous games have returned in one way or another, but can be used much more intricately than before.
And then also wanting to have a much deeper version of almost all the weapons. A lot of the weapons had alternate functions, special versions. There were layers upon layers upon layers of nuance in the design that I don't think anyone or a lot of people didn't notice. We had a vehicle with the mouse on the top, and you could fire off the missile and it would auto fly into a target and do a little damage. If you managed to fly it on your own into the target, it did like triple damage, but you could also shoot it down, and then there were things like certain vehicles were more susceptible. We had a helicopter in the game, which I know a lot of the fans didn't like. I thought it would be a cool addition to the gameplay. And a lot of people were like, oh, this fucking thing is too hard. It's too hard to fight. But you could bring that thing down in a heartbeat if you just launched an EMP sort of freeze missile at it. And it would crash to the ground. And if the player wasn't fast banging on the buttons, you could ram into them and kill them with one big ram. So I wanted to sort of bring a lot more depth into the franchise across the board. Esports hadn't really become a big thing, but we definitely thought of it as a contender for one of the deep, meaty online games that you and your friends broke out when you really wanted to have a serious competition.
The single-player campaign has more to its design as well. Sure, a lot of objectives stick to the typical kill all the contestants, but there were other kinds of scenarios as well, such as endurance death matches and even a few racing missions. This portion of the single-player campaign was considerably frustrating for some players, especially the third race. They might like to know that even David personally thought this was poorly implemented.
I walked into the office, they're in Utah, I'm in San Diego, and I walked into the office one day. I flew out there every 3 to 6 weeks. And then I would deal with them and talk to them, and they would deal with me every day on the phone and video chat and whatnot. But I came out there and suddenly there's racing in the game. And I'm like, what is this? And Scott's like, well, one of the programmers, a really key, important programmer, incredibly talented programmer, he thought it would be fun. So he came in on his own time and he put it in. And I was like, this is not good. I mean, and that's not a knock at him. He's one of the best online programmers and game programmers I've ever worked with. But the physics of the cars, the maps, it's just not set up to do racing. I don't think he would take offense if I were to tell you that he may still have had his head back in the PS1 days. That would have flown. Good enough would have flown. But when you're coming out on PS3 where you have GTA and you have Gran Turismo and you have, I think there might have been a Midnight Club out, and there was certainly a Paradise City out from EA, and, Need for Speed, and you're trying to sort of play in that playground with the big boys, good enough isn't even close. And so when you put racing in there, and it's like a C- at best version of racing, it's unacceptable. I hated it. From the minute it got in, we were trying to figure out how to make it work because, frankly, we didn't want to upset and demoralize the programmer. And a lot of times when you make games, you have those kinds of decisions that you have to make, which is a guy who's a crucial part to the online. I don't know if he would have been so demoralized that he would have quit, but it was made clear to me that this was sort of his baby, and he thought that the testers really liked it, and he thought it was important. And did we want to run the risk of going to war and demoralizing somebody that was going to be so crucial to other parts of the game that to me were more important, like the online being great? And so ultimately we just said, let's try to make it work. We never made it work. It was a horrible part of the game. It's a great example of why that relationship worked when it did and didn't when it didn't. That relationship with Utah worked when it did, when I was a Sony employee and Sony was footing the bill. I could go to my boss at Sony and say, look, this is going to fuck our game up. You need to call Utah and figure this out. And I could convince my boss, and because my boss was the guy signing the checks, not always, because these aren't puppets. These are hardworking, talented, well-paid, brilliant engineers and designers and artists. They would win as many fights as they lost, but at least we got to have those fucking fights. When you don't have that structure and you're part of that team, you have to start factoring in really obnoxious things like team morale, which at the very end, I should have been able to put my foot down and say, you know what, we tried to make this racing work for 6 months. It doesn't. Let's have focus groups to prove that it doesn't, so people don't just think I'm being an asshole. But maybe we were just so busy with 1,000 other little things that somehow survived. And that happens in games all the time. It was an absolute mistake. I don't think it necessarily cost us sales. I don't think it's like the game died because of it, but we should have known better. We should have been better because it did hurt the overall product. It's a terrible part of the product. There's 2 reasons I think they suck. If you don't pick the right car, they're a pain in the ass. We're not giving you enough situational awareness, so you're getting attacked from all sides by the AI. So a lot of times, no matter how good you drive, if you get out in front of the pack, you're fucked. If you hang out in the middle of the pack, you're fucked. Because the AI really wasn't designed to be racing and fighting AI. It's like, okay, I guess we're driving in a straight line, but I'm still going to try to blow the fuck out of one guy, which is the player, And then the other part was just that it didn't feel very good. It didn't feel very good to drive in a straight, curvy line with the physics of those cars. The Twisted Metal cars are really designed to be drive, do a 180, flip around, reacquire, drive, do a 180, flip around, do a 180, and then break off for a little bit to get weapons and then go back into that offensive mode. But this was continuously just drive And it very quickly made it clear that the physics of Twisted Metal are not actual vehicle physics. They're not meant to really drive like cars. They're meant to trick you into thinking they're cars. But if we actually had them drive like cars like Interstate 76 or Twisted Metal 3, you would be very frustrated. And that's fine in the context of Twisted Metal, but the minute you say, hey, go race it like a real car, almost immediately you're like, this feels like shit. Especially compared to, Burnout, Paradise City, and all the other fucking top racers that were out at the time that players had to compare it with.
I'll agree it's very unbalanced, and he's right about it not belonging in how they designed Twisted Metal. If you're using a big sluggish vehicle, you might as well not even try keeping up. But it can still be a lot of fun, albeit frustrating. Also, the way the second race ends is just hilarious. What? I assumed I lost, but I guess I'm still in this? I wonder... Oh, shit! Jeez! I didn't read the description! The game would also feature local multiplayer for up to 4 people, and they actually advertised it like it was a big deal, which it kind of was. Just like when a game doesn't have health regeneration, this feature really is something that was so scarce that it actually did make sense to advertise back then. The bosses in this game were especially amazing. It was so insane battling those gargantuan mechanical beasts, challenging your car combat abilities. These scenarios were by far the absolute highlight of the single-player campaign. I think it's pretty clear at this point that the game world felt more like the original PlayStation titles, complete with music that matched its over-the-top chaotic atmosphere. It would also include a decent amount of licensed tunes that are really jamming when you're in the midst of wrecking your opponents.
I would go into iTunes, Scott would go into iTunes, we'd send them back and forth with each other, then we'd send them to Sony Music or the Sony Music people at PlayStation and say, hey, here's a bunch of things we like. They're like, these 8 you can have, these 3 they'll never give you the rights to, these 2 you can't afford, but we can have somebody re-record it. This one that you really like AC/DC, if you get what you want from AC/DC, you're going to have to give up like 8 other songs, but we can give you this band. And here's this song called Raise the Flag that they did that sounds just like AC/DC. It was a constant playing within the playground of that budget, but as long as we stayed in the budget, between me and Scott and most importantly the Sony Music folks at PlayStation, we eventually kind of cobbled it together based on just sort of what we thought captured the essence of the game.
A lot more variety than the licensed tracks for Twisted Metal 3 and 4, but even if they're not your cup of tea, the game allows you to play custom songs that are stored in your PS3's hard drive. Jaffe tried to find a balance between what worked for Twisted Metal 2 and what worked for Twisted Metal Black, which makes sense since those 2 games garnered the most attention and recognition in the series.
We ended up going more traditional Twisted Metal, but for a long time we tried to keep that sort of street theme, but we just couldn't quite get it for a number of reasons. And so probably 8-10 months into the title, Scott and I both threw the towel in and said, fuck it, let's put armor on the cars. Let's do what we know works in the context of Twisted Metal. And obviously we never wanted to go as dark as Black. We didn't want to go as sort of wacky as Twisted Metal 2 or Head On. So we ended up trying to find sort of a sweet spot that still had the fantasy elements, but at the same time felt a bit more grounded.
While he's talking more about presentation, I think they struck that rhythm perfectly in regards to the gameplay as well. The rambunctiousness of 2 with the razor-edge strategy of Black. You have to pay a lot more attention to everything around you, and all the vehicles have alterations to their special abilities as well. And I'm barely even scraping the surface here. Diving deeper into the world, the story, and how it's presented is very hit or miss. David and the crew would, in fact, return to live-action actors for the first time since the removed endings back in 1995. Looks like he wanted to make some use out of his college degree and education one more time.
So I knew we were going to have to do story when Sony came in, and I'm like, oh shit, now we got to do story again, which I didn't mind, but that wasn't where my head was. I was like, I really want to just be 100% focused on the gameplay. I didn't want to do Twisted Metal Head On or Twisted Metal 2. I thought that kind of flash animation also was archaic at the time. You couldn't do that on a PS3 title. But I mean, you could, but I always hated it. It felt cheap. Like I remember when Infamous came out on PS3 and they had this kind of comic book cutscene stuff. And for me, it's so clear they just don't have the money. It doesn't feel like a style choice. It just feels cheap to me. So that wasn't an option. Doing high-end CG wasn't an option because of the budget. And so I was in the movies and I saw the standees for the first live-action G.I. Joe movie. And I remember thinking they looked really cool. I mean, they were hyper real. They were obviously super digital Photoshop, but I was like, that's really cool. And then I remember seeing the opening of The Watchmen. In the credit sequence, everybody was moving super slow, you know? And so I went to Sony and I said, hey, what if we just write movies where we just have each movie be like maybe 5 or 6 shots like The Watchmen done in the G.I. Joe poster style, and we'll just have a narrator talk over it. And they were like, okay, yeah, we could do that. And then ultimately what ended up happening is I went into the office to storyboard it with those guys. I just started adding live action to it. And before you knew it, we were making a movie. We ended up making a 45-minute live action movie, basically. So that wasn't the intention, but that's kind of what happened. And it was nice that it ended up kind of throwing back to old PS1 live action cutscenes. Your mileage may vary depending on how successful you thought they were, but I thought they worked for the product. So.
Shut up and bleed, you motherfucker.
It's my dream to see them go for the stylish animation from Twisted Metal Black, but I understand where David is coming from. For those that may not have enjoyed the live-action endings from the original game, you'll probably get more out of this. It clearly has a bigger budget and does a better job building its own world, but there's definitely no hokiness or genuinely cheesy acting, so people like me that love the original game's endings might find this somewhat lacking. There's just as much to love about these cutscenes as there is to hate. I will say the visuals don't look too bad and it is stylish at times, but the very obvious amount of green screen is pretty garish. Even so, it's bold to get live action actors and green screen to do video game cutscenes. I haven't seen this since, I don't know, Mortal Kombat Mythologies? However, this 30-year-old dude in a wig playing the Preacher is just ridiculous. It appears though that it has no connections with any previous entries to the series. The only small threads are random references and Easter eggs, many which are seen here. Hey look, War of the Monsters. Calypso is a man of taste.
There is no perception in Twisted Metal for us of like canon. It's almost like a fairy tale and we're just telling it different ways. It's always Calypso, his contest, he fucks you over. We give a little bit more about his backstory, but we're not in the middle of some grand 9 maxi series Game of Thrones thing where all of this will ultimately culminate in a giant revelation about who it's not ever that. Those games don't exist in a lot of ways. If you talk to Sweet Tooth from Twisted Metal 2012 and he didn't kill you, he actually was willing to have a conversation with you, and you said, hey, remember that time where you asked to be a bug in this old lady's garden? I think he would first say, I love how fucking crazy you are, and number 2, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. They're not living this mega story even within a single game. 2012, one version Sweet Tooth wins, one version Dollface wins, one version Mr. Grimm wins. It's all just crazy.
When I kill you, maybe I'll use your skull for a helmet. That sounds familiar.
There were supposed to be more obvious connections and homages to the previous games, and some of them are just too ridiculous to be true, such as the original Preacher's End revealing that it's in fact the same one from Twisted Metal Black, and he's actually telling this entire story in the same asylum from that old PS2 game. In my opinion, getting rid of all these bizarre tie-ins was for the best, since it really would have just muddled the characters' stories and make them feel less consistent.
I was really unhappy when the movies started coming in where we shot all of them and we knew we were going to have to do some reshoots, but when we started editing them, I was like, these are not working. And so instead of trying to make 9 different movies, 3 for each character, I said, let's just make 1 for each character and put all of our resources into making those as good as we can. And we'll have a better shot at these actually working because we'll be able to spend the next 8 months just focused on 1 Sweet Tooth story, 1 Dollface story, 1 Grimm story. And in that, a lot of the things like the Preacher and him ending up being trapped in Calypso's wall forevermore and Sweet Chick at the end being the daughter, all that ended up getting rewritten with the second batch of reshoots. That was never meant to be sort of what it was. It's just that was how I was able to cobble together all of the stuff we had already shot into one big story, which is what we ended up having to do.
Send me back, Calypso. I gotta admit, I'd have shot that motherfucker too. Bring it!
I suppose you can say the story was the most disappointing aspect of this game, thus a good amount of people disregard Twisted Metal 2012 rather quickly. My main gripe isn't even how these are presented, it's the fact that there's only 3 separate character stories this time. Considering the structure is similar to Twisted Metal Black, it's kind of a bummer. I can see David is trying to make them compelling to some degree, but it just doesn't work. Not the way it did in Twisted Metal Black, at least. That's why I don't have a lot to say about these stories. The strong ties to fantasy aspects are definitely closer to Twisted Metal 2's stories, which is all good and fun, just not something that really sticks with me. And I have to emphasize that I adored how David and Scott's Twisted Metal games always had a great array of nut jobs driving these haphazardly put together vehicles of destruction. I really miss that more than ever. It's also kind of insulting to have someone else drive Axel's signature vehicle, but maybe I'm getting too nitpicky. Speaking of, I'll take the good with the bad. I like the garage mechanic for the single player campaign. Being able to select vehicles before stages and switch between them is very handy, and this new direction in the single player campaign allowed them to have more variety in the missions. This wouldn't have made as much contextual sense if they still had unique characters for every single vehicle.
For me, because we really wanted to try to say, look, we want to increase the appeal of the franchise. I thought, and I still kind of think, that having people hang out the windows of cars with sniper rifles and shotguns and lean out the windows with grenades was going to feel more Fast and the Furious, stunt show. It was going to be less fantasy and more like an action movie, which would allow us to sell more copies and connect with more people. So the minute we knew we were doing that, we're like, well, who's the guy sitting in the passenger seat? We can't fucking write 2 stories per car. There was also, and then we could have gotten around this, but it just kind of felt weird that you could have a team of like 4 sweet tooth trucks with the same driver, the same passenger. It's kind of like when you played that, what was the Marvel Diablo ripoff that came out for a while, Marvel Heroes or something, and there was like 6 Ben Grimms running around New York all fighting. It's like, it doesn't matter, it's a game, but it just felt weird. So we, from the very beginning, said, let's have drivers and gunners, and let's let them change cars so that when you're on the same team, it's not like Mr. Grimm is on the same team with Mortimer and Axel, and then on the other team, there's another Axel. It just didn't make any sense as a team game. So when we said, okay, if we're going to make you stay on a team, let's make you stay on the team of clowns or dolls or Grimms or whatever, especially because we're going to let you drive different vehicles, because that's part of the team play. Otherwise, it would be like everybody on one team is just a motorcycle.
Still, the lacking story doesn't outclass the gameplay, which I think is easily the best this series has ever been. It almost feels like everyone involved knew this could be the end of Twisted Metal, so they wanted to give it all they got. Although, not all fans of the series would agree with me. While Twisted Metal Black provides that fantastic world building and unique characters and their experiences with the Demented world, Twisted Metal 2012 was able to give me the absolute peak of gameplay and performance I could ever imagine for this franchise. If only the story aspect had more to deliver than this. In the end, it felt like getting 3 new stories for a Twisted Metal Black, but not in the same essence. And with more than 10 years removed, people definitely expressed their dissatisfaction. Still, I think if they listen to what David's saying about the game's production, it makes more sense why the whole package ended up the way it did.
So everything was driven by that gameplay decision, and it was interesting because the first time I really got the sense that the fans were not going to be happy with that. And again, not all the fans. That's what I'm saying. The hardest part about making Twisted Metal these days is there are like 5 or 4 different types of things people love about it. And there is a large vocal community of people who love the characters and love the story. I would go online after the game came out and I was like heartbroken because people were like, oh, I fucking hate the story. And I was like, oh my God, we worked so hard on those. We focus tested them. I tried so hard not to make them cheesy. I hired another director because I don't want to fuck this up. And when you press them, they would say, well, no, the stories that were in there were fine. When I say I hate the stories, what I mean is I hate that there weren't stories like the old games where every car had a character, every character had his own ending. And we were at Comic-Con when we started to hear their feedback of like, oh shit, they don't like this decision. And Scott and me and Kellen, who was the art director, were sitting at the Omni at breakfast during Comic-Con in like 2010 going, is there any way we can really quickly make it so we can have a mode where you can have all the old characters? And we're like, maybe if we finish early, but we never did. So, I mean, it didn't hurt us necessarily, but I do know to this day that there are fans of Twisted Metal that are disappointed that we didn't follow the traditional structure. But that was why, because again, this was a game that started as team-based Twisted Metal, multiplayer only. Once Sony came in and said, we have to have single player, it was kind of a retrofit. And I'm not saying we would have changed it even if we knew we needed story at the beginning, but we probably would have. Some of this stuff would have been obvious if from the beginning we're like, hey, if we make that decision for the team, how's that going to affect single player? But because we weren't even thinking about single player when these decisions were getting sort of, laid into the concrete, by the time it was revealed to us that we needed single player, it was way, way, way past the expiration date of changing things.
So both games certainly have their highlights. One thing is assured though, is that it's really hard to convince someone new to Twisted Metal that this is a good place to begin.
There was so much depth there that if you didn't learn the depth and you just played the game on the surface, a lot of people played it, they had fun crashing into the buildings, blowing things up, and about an hour later they were bored with it. I don't think we necessarily made a game as deep as Street Fighter, but did we make a game as deep as maybe a really good Mortal Kombat? I think we did. But the difference is that when you go into Mortal Kombat, there's a whole list of moves and attacks and abilities just under the surface that you are responsible for learning and discovering. But people didn't realize that with Twisted Metal 2012. And so it would be the equivalent of playing Mortal Kombat and all you're doing is punching and kicking and going, this is fun, it's kind of neat, but it's pretty shallow. And if you don't know to look for that depth in a car combat game, which people didn't because we didn't train them to, you wind up with a lot of your sort of basic audience, like just comes to the table because the commercial was good or the graphics look good, or they remember playing it a long time ago and go, yeah, it's fine, but it's pretty fucking simple. What's the big deal? So that's a long fucking answer, but that was sort of the gist of what we wanted to achieve with Twisted 12.
I can understand the issues people have with this, and I'm not going to talk like I'm some Twisted Metal tournament level prodigy. I'm nowhere close to that. But seeing this balance between the pace of Twisted Metal 2, Twisted Metal Black, and cranked to a maximum level in just about all other aspects, it's plain as day that the developers wanted the gameplay to be better than ever, and I personally think they achieved that with flying colors.
I wanted to sort of bring a lot more depth into the franchise across the board. Esports hadn't really become a thing at the time, or a big thing, but we definitely thought of it as a contender for one of the deep, meaty online games that you and your friends broke out when you really wanted to have a serious competition.
How about that? A PlayStation exclusive title published by Sony in the West, focusing on the depth of the gameplay above everything else. No wonder this series isn't around anymore.
By the time people were really sharing a lot of videos, we had our time in the sun with that game. So there weren't a lot of opportunities for me to see people present themselves as a team. They may have been playing online as a team and hopefully doing some of that stuff that we had intended. But because there wasn't like a sense of a presentation, or it wasn't like a team is streaming at 4:00 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, everybody tune in to watch this fucking thing, you don't really know how people took it. But all I can tell you is that's how we intended it. I get the sense based on internet feedback that some people vibed with what we were trying to do. There was a group of fans from the older games that were looking, I think, for a different kind of depth. Like, I think Twisted 12 is loaded with depth. It's probably the meatiest Twisted we've ever made. But there was a level of depth or a certain type of depth we had in Twisted Metal Black, a lot of which was totally unintentional and accidental, but that the online community of Twisted Metal fans discovered simply by just going, hey, did you know you could fucking do this? And the developer's like, nope, that's pretty cool. Never thought about it. And so I know they were disappointed because the depth they were looking for wasn't necessarily represented. It was a different type of depth. But once you put the game out there, especially back in those days, you don't really have much evidence if it's affecting players in the way you want it to. I can tell you it certainly didn't catch on as a massive competitive success, which was absolutely the intention. We wanted to make a go-to evergreen, deep competitive game that people would still be playing today.
That, sadly, is the crux of this franchise's problem. Twisted Metal is a hard dish to serve for the masses. Hell, at this point it's become hard to serve to Twisted Metal fans. Think about it. You want to make a game that would please this franchise's fans that like the interesting stories, fans that like the deep combat mechanics, and potential Twisted Metal fans that can't exactly get comfortable falling in the deep end of this pool. That's an extremely hard thing to really achieve when it comes to a new installment in a well-established franchise.
Our original impetus for this was, can we grow this franchise? We knew the budgets were going to be bigger than they had ever been before. We knew that the global market, if not entire globe, at least Europe, was more important to the franchise. And in the past, Europe had no interest in it. And we knew that part of the appeal of Black was its M rating, and not just the fact that it had an M rating, but what caused it to have an M rating was the appeal of it, which was sort of the dark stories and the violence and the sort of grindhouse stuff, which doesn't play in Europe all that well, to the point that they didn't even have the movies in Twisted Metal Black. So we tried for the longest time to have a T rating. We were kind of like, Twisted Metal 1, Twisted Metal 2 were T-rated games, so was 3, so was 4. And we were like, you know what, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of kids that are turned on by cars and guns, and they may eventually grow into hardcore fans that we're going after. But this time, let's not sort of turn our backs on the fact that there's probably a lot of 9-year-old kids who would totally explode with glee if they're like, shit, I can drive around that city and blow it up with guns and rockets, and my mom and dad let me do it because I'm not like killing people with bloody and hitting them and running them over and shit and knocking them into bloody pulps. So for the longest time, we were really shooting for a T, but the movies came online and it ended up saying, yeah, there's no way we're getting a T with these movies.
Perhaps this is why the series is at a complete standstill. Twisted Metal 2012 was profitable, but it wasn't a big hit for Sony or the franchise. Twisted Metal 2 remains as the financial peak of the series' timeline. This has led David to a conclusion that's hard to face for any creator, especially one that's been supporting a particular series for such a long time. Not only that, but his desire on where he wants to take this franchise might seem reductive, even too juvenile for it to really be a massive hot seller.
End of the day, my desire to have great success in business is beaten into submission by the 12-year-old in me that's like, I can drag somebody behind a car and they scream in pain. That's amazing. Let's do that.
I guess it takes more than American ingenuity to make a game series like this successful. Does it mean the end of the Twisted Metal series?
Now, I'm going to show everyone what happens when Sweet Tooth gets out of the truck.
Twisted Metal has created a legacy for the PlayStation, so much that it would receive modest guest appearances in some games. Sweet Tooth was even a playable fighter in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, which surprisingly David had more involvement with the initial idea than I had realized.
PlayStation All-Stars was my idea, and it was Cory Barlog's idea independently.
Cory Barlog was the head director of God of War 2 and would go on as sole director and head writer for that franchise's 2018 title.
But it was everybody who plays games with the fucking brains idea. Because there's nothing clever about saying, hey, we want to do a Sony version of Smash Brothers, right? So I just happened to bring it up. Cory just happened to bring it up roughly around the same time. And that's all I had to do with it.
David was more than happy, of course, to let his creations get in on the action. Come on, of course Sweet Tooth and especially Kratos would be playable characters. The developers of PlayStation All-Stars were even kind enough to reach out to Jaffe for his opinion on how they were designing them. Something they obviously didn't have to do since he doesn't own the IPs, but a very kind gesture. Sounds like he was the most relaxed about the whole thing, apparently.
And then when it came time to put Sweet Tooth in, they will go unnamed. But let me just make it clear to you that there are studios within the Sony structure that give a shit about their characters to the point that if you want to use their characters in a game, it's like, nope, the shirt's not exactly right. The hair's not exactly right. He or she would never do that. And I'm like, really? You're not negotiating the contract for Jennifer Lawrence to appear in an X-Men film. It's a video game character. No one gives a shit. No one gives a shit. They sent me pictures. Is this okay for Sweet Tooth? I'm like, well, do you guys like it? They're like, yeah. I'm like, it's fine with me. We didn't care. It's not that we didn't care because we were apathetic, but it was like, look, you're making your game. Sony trusts you to make your game. As long as you don't turn Sweet Tooth into Strawberry Shortcake, we're fine.
I mean, I wouldn't say nobody cares. The most surprising thing about this is that the suits at Sony didn't already get this ball rolling. I don't know, maybe it would have been for the better. But I got to live a short and wild dream of being top ranked in an online multiplayer crossover fighter with Sweet Tooth as my main. Never thought that would be a thing. Also, it's pretty cute seeing him and Kratos have a little confrontation.
Who doesn't love an ice cream cone? Pretty neat trick there, pal. Let's see if I can match it.
Another cretin sent by a so-called god.
I honestly thought it would be more like, I'm David's favorite creation. No, I am. No, me. While a lot of the guest appearances are small, it's nice to see various developers, including those outside of Sony, give remembrance to a once thriving car combat franchise. Apparently a Twisted Metal movie was at one point being planned.
I met with the producers and stuff like that. I remember 2012 was released. I want to say we were out in the desert of Vegas doing the Shoot My Truck promotion when that game came out. And on that same day, Variety ran the article saying the guys that did Ghost Rider are really interested. They've signed up to do a Twisted Metal movie. And I was just telling people, it's just like, it probably won't happen. These things rarely fucking happen. And so I was engaged with it enough that I had met with the producer, talked with the producer. He and I used to go back and forth on IM sometimes. I think he was also the producer of Ghost Rider. It was Avi Arad. My understanding is a script went off to Sony. They thought it was too expensive. Then there was another crack at it where they wanted to make it kind of more Fast and the Furious meets Twisted Metal. And Sony was like, it's too expensive. I absolutely think there is a great B movie waiting to happen in Twisted Metal.
Jaffe thinks, though, that a movie about Twisted Metal needs to ride a certain line that makes it feel B-movie and cheap, but still have super entertaining action.
The Death Race series is mostly terrible, but do I think it could be good enough to be a good B franchise with all the characters and all the stunts? Absolutely. I think if anybody went to try to make Twisted Metal and tried to spend the money of a Fury Road, that would be their mistake.
This kind of mentality should be obvious. Twisted Metal is a rough and tumble car combat game packed with explosive action. It's only right to have a movie in the B territory if it were to exist. That'd be one way to have a movie adaptation understand and honor the source material. This idea, however, seemed to have been dropped quickly.
Twisted Metal works when it works because it knows what it is. It is a bar band. It is a garage band. It is rough and tumble and ragged around the edges, and it likes that about itself. It doesn't want to be a $160 million movie.
I have a feeling that after the colossal failure that was the Ratchet & Clank movie, Sony is not interested in more film adaptations of their franchises. The Sly movie is basically vaporware at this point. Thank God. Fast forward to 2019, however, and it looks like Twisted Metal will see the beginning of a movement Sony is trying, where their original IPs receive TV show adaptations. You're not even being clever this time, Sony. However, David is not involved in the production. I can't say I have a lot of expectations.
I was at Comic-Con over the summer, and there's a Sweet Tooth plushie at this point, so I'm just glad that he's still out there making a little bit of goddamn noise, you know? I see your Funko Pop back there of him. I got a Funko Pop of him. I think he's a really neat character, man. So hopefully they'll continue doing stuff with him.
They say one day the clown will return, stronger and madder than before.
What's left of the series? It's been more than 7 years since the launch of Twisted Metal on PlayStation 3, but the franchise remains dormant. Jaffe has talked about his thoughts on Twisted Metal's future multiple times, stating the same thing over and over, but I doubt that's going to stop fans from constantly asking already answered questions on his streams and Twitter and what have you. He has no control over the IP, and the only way he'd be able to make another title in the series is if Sony grants him permission and funding for it. Something Sony does not seem ready to do. Also, guys, stop writing him, just make Twisted Metal a free-to-play battle royale. There, I just saved the franchise. You're welcome. He's heard it a billion times already. David left Eat Sleep Play to start his own company, Bartlett Jones. This team created Drawn to Death, a multiplayer-only third-person shooter that breathed very unique visuals and had a really fun, childlike atmosphere to it. The game really brings back the feeling of drawing on your planner or notebook to pass the time back in grade school. I also don't think it's a stretch to say the overall humor and style of this game is more of what Twisted Metal Small Brawl would have been like if David was involved in that game's production.
I was exceptionally happy with how it came out. I mean, I think it's some of the best multiplayer game design I've ever had the fortune of being involved with. I fucked up and made the same mistake I made with Twisted Metal, which is we built an incredibly deep swimming pool and forgot to sort of build a shallow end that was welcoming enough to teach people how to swim. And so just like my analogy of Mortal Kombat, people came into Drawn to Death and they just sort of ran around and shot people. If they had the misfortune of being dropped into a match with 3 other people who also didn't know, how to play the game, you just ran around with shotguns and Uzis and were like, what the fuck is this? This is like a game from 12 years ago. There's nothing interesting about this. But it would be the equivalent of putting 2 people in an arcade and say, play Street Fighter 4, and they have no idea there's all these moves. It's Ken punching Chun-Li and Chun-Li kicking Ken. That's all they do. And they're like, well, this is fucking boring. Let's go play something else. And a lot of them never got around to see people start playing the game at the level that game can be played at and go, oh, that's really cool. So I was really happy with it as a game. I think it's the best multiplayer game I've ever had the fortune to work on. I think tonally it worked, but I anticipated that because we were starting out as a free-to-play game. And listen, this is 2 for 2, Jaffe. It's like, don't change horses in midstream. We should have stayed free-to-play, because the reason it was meant to be free-to-play is we made a bunch of decisions about the tone and the depth of the game, because like League of Legends, we said, look, it's going to be free. It might get off to a slow start, but people will eventually, hopefully, start discovering stuff, and it's free. And it's like, oh shit, you got to play this game. How much does it cost? No, just go fucking download it. That was our anticipation of it. And we made a lot of decisions built around that.
Unfortunately, the game did not go over well, and its failure would cause the company to go out of business. It just goes to show you that even if you pour your heart and soul into something, you still, gotta be careful.
Even with the tone, I'm really proud of the story of that game. But if you read the reviews, most of the reviews are like, what story, Jaffe? It's just this vulgar game where the people say shit and there's a frog that insults you all the time. What the fuck are you talking about? There's a great, deep, interesting world in that game that I remain proud of. It's not their job. It's my job. But I had hoped the press would talk up that part and say, there's a surface to this game that looks very vulgar and obnoxious and juvenile, and that is absolutely accurate. And if you start to explore the world, if you start to read the tutorials, if you start to look up in the skybox and see things happening, that it might take you 20 matches before you go, oh shit, there's something happening in the high school that you can see through a rip in the paper, and you start to have sympathy for the guy who's drawing all this shit. I had hoped that they would sort of seed that out to the audience, but instead they were just like, fuck this, this is childish, this is juvenile, this is not mature like The Last of Us, I want to feel mature. I told my mom I was a big boy critic now, writing about serious, important things. Fuck this game, 4 out of 10. Fuck you, Jaffe, you relic motherfucker.
Here's one snippet of Drawn to Death's story people can still see a little more clearly. Yes, even the trophy list has a small bit of world building. It's really sad. The game wasn't amazing to me or anything, but I thought it was pretty goofy, fun to play for a bit, and really spoke to me as someone that enjoyed The Grid, an arcade-exclusive third-person arena shooter. I remember the acid spit coming from every direction when this game came out. People hated it. People still hate it now.
The company responsible for the main series, Twisted Metal Games, dissolved some time ago, and Jaffe spent most of this generation on the incredibly mediocre and ugly as sin shooter Drawn to Death.
Yeah, wow, that really added to your video. You're a really good fucking writer. David partially chalks the game's failure up to his own shortcomings and thinks it could have been executed better. Drawn to Death is now in an unplayable state as the online servers have been completely shut down. David didn't take a lot of the hatred too well. I wouldn't even call it criticism when it came to people yelling about this game. It was just mean-spirited. I still see people online rub it in his face as a form of mockery that in their head makes them look like a better person than David. I think if they listened to how high Jaffe's hopes were for this game's success and his ground-level reflection on it now, they'd think twice before speaking so harshly. At least out of politeness.
I'm not saying it's the audience's fault or the critics' fault. I'm saying it's my fault because I thought the game would hold their attention long enough that they would play it enough that they would start to see things and they would seed that out there and go, this game starts as one thing and then holy shit, we've started to discover there's a lot of storytelling in this game, which is not as vulgar and on the nose. It's about a kid in an abusive home and how he deals with his abusive stepfather. It's like the Wizard of Oz. The fucking crazy teddy bear, Alan, is the kid's stepfather. The guy, Bronco, who's the soldier, is his brother, who he idolizes, but his brother is basically living in a drug flop house because he came back from war and had his leg amputated, and the kid can't come to grips with the fact that his hero is actually a human who's having this massive depression he's going through. Everything in there is in there. It comes out, and I'm like, I was waiting. Where on my shelf am I going to put my BAFTA? Where on the shelf am I going to put my DICE award? Because I know they're coming, because this is some subversive, deep shit that we've done. Nobody cared. Not only did they not care, but they mocked it relentlessly. They were rude and crude and mean and cruel, and it was quite painful. But all that said, I still think it's one of the best things I've ever worked on. Drawn to Death is Twisted Metal on foot. If people don't see that, then I've done a horrible job, because those characters are vehicles, basically, in a car combat game. It's an arena brawler, just like Twisted Metal.
After a year-long hiatus, David has announced that he's working on a new single-player game. He still maintains a good relationship with Sony, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's brewing in that kooky mind of his. As for the Twisted Metal series, besides the TV show that I assume is still in production, there are no revealed plans for the franchise. But in a world where Medieval can get a remake, I don't see why Twisted Metal wouldn't get a chance to come back and reintroduce car combat to a new generation. However, David rationalizes that making a brand new entry at this point would be extremely tough because of how divided the remaining fans have become, especially after the 2012 title.
Like I said, there's 4 or 5 different types of Twisted players, and if we were ever to make another one, it would be really, really, really fucking hard, because I don't think we would ever get the money to try to make a game to appeal to all of them. The best thing we could do at this point is to make a comic book or a graphic novel to sort of continue to flesh out the universe, which I would love to do, and then focus gameplay-wise just on multiplayer, because no one really wants a single-player Twisted Metal at this point, unless we're really going to go Grand Theft Auto or God of War or Spider-Man and tell a proper single-player story in the Twisted Metal universe. The days of like, hey, it's level 7, drive around and kill 15 cars to move to the next level. Those days are long gone. Those days were long gone in 2012. They're certainly long gone now.
Still, little in this world would make my heart soar more than hear about a new Twisted Metal game led by the likes of David Jaffe and Scott Campbell, because none of these ho-hum titles by imitators can really get the job done.
But I also wanted to ask why are you here, because I feel like people always talk about like the stuff that you make and, you know, your franchises you've worked on over the years.
Yeah.
But I notice every time a new car combat game comes out, there's not a lot these days, but every once in a while I see them, and I try to play them. I'm not really into them. They don't really grab me.
Yeah.
Has there ever been like a car combat game within the past, like I would say 10, 12 years that you think like actually
No.
You know, it scratches that itch for people?
No.
You know?
But I'll tell you I'll tell you the reason why. The reason why is that we never looked at the cars in Twisted Metal as cars. I mean, we knew that they were cars in terms of how they were presented, and the more we could present them as actual cars, that was important. But we did not give a fuck about car physics. And every goddamn car combat game that comes out seems to think the magic secret sauce is let's fucking make them fucking drive like real cars. But we looked at this like a fucking 3D arena fighter. And so we had our cars being able to turn in midair. We didn't have all this shit where you had slow acceleration. If you wanted to go somewhere, you point in that direction and you just fucking go. So a lot of the reason I don't think a lot of car combat games are working these days is because they literally are caught in this idea that, oh, a good car combat game is built on real physics. And it's like, no,
realistic.
It's built on the presentation of realistic physics, but not the actual.
Me and my brother, we loved the original Twisted Metal games, and we noticed something was like you can turn while you're in midair. Little things like that really did it for me. Like it helps you control it.
Absolutely,
even though it's not
because
realistic.
you're not a fucking car. It's a 3D arena brawler. If you think about it as
and I love those kinds of games. There's not a lot these days.
No, there's not. It was like Power Stone, but with presentation of cars. The other thing a lot of the games do these days, which I hate, is that they let you keep the right stick to control camera, and so. With Twisted Metal, we always knew that 95% of the combat was going to be based on what you're looking at. And so we put a premium on allowing the player to do those T-slides and 180s and quick flip arounds and all that stuff so you could reacquire your target. But a lot of games today are like, oh, we'll just let you look around with the right stick. Well, if you do that, the pacing drops off a fucking cliff.
Oh, yeah, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of thought that goes into those games, and I would love to make another one day if the economy is correct. But right now it doesn't make a lot of sense. But I'm glad you played them. I'm glad your brother enjoyed them, and I appreciate you calling in. Thanks, man.
If the likes of Sony ever do consider a remake of sorts, I think the best option would be to mash the original two games together, gameplay-wise, and built around the engine used for Twisted Metal 2012. Roster, stages, everything completely recreated for the newest hardware. That way, people get to see how the franchise started with Twisted Metal 1's stages and roster, but also experience what is typically regarded as the peak of the franchise with Twisted Metal 2's content and design. Kinda like how Activision made Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, except, you know, good. I'm getting off topic though. David looks back at his accomplishments and failures with pure satisfaction. There's a good chance Sony will be willing to give him another shot down the line, as they've been so gracious with Jaffe for decades now, whether it's Twisted Metal or something completely new.
I've never felt anything but total support from Sony. Did I sit in a meeting with Kaz Hirai where he said, look, you have to make some changes to a couple of these things? Sure. But it wasn't lost on me that 98% of what I wanted, I got. There's always going to be some compromise when you're spending someone else's fucking money. I didn't have a problem with that.
In the end, that's what any game developer really desires, for their backers to have trust in their vision. While financial success is something people will strive for in this business, they also want to be creative. They want to show the world what they're made of and maybe have a shot at creating a legacy. Something that they'll be remembered for by fans and loved ones alike.
There's two ways to run your creative life. One is that you kind of live in a shell and you barely peek your head out and you don't cause any waves and you make what the man tells you and you end up maybe having some success or a lot of success, and that's great. Every game I have had the pleasure to work on, and I may never make a game again, or I may make 20 more games before it's all over, have been passion projects. And even though there are people, or a lot of people, who, even if you look at something like Drawn to Death, if you look at something like Calling All Cars, which are my two least successful games I've worked on, I don't think you can look at those and say there's not a heartbeat to these games. It may be a nasty fucking heartbeat that you don't like. You can look at Drawn to Death and hate it, but the reasons you hate it in a meaningful way is because you're responding to my personal soulful vision. And you're just saying, I see the vision, Jaffe, I just don't like it. I'm so grateful that I so far have gotten to have that kind of career, that every game I've worked on, short of Mickey Mania, because it was the first thing I ever had a chance to work on, that's my DNA. Those are my children. And it doesn't mean the rest of the team doesn't feel that way, but speaking for me personally, that is my children. I guarantee you, especially these days, most game developers cannot say that. People don't take chances. A lot of people in the creative world are kind of cowardly. They don't swing for the fucking fences, and they follow a paint by numbers process because that's what the people who pay the checks have asked them to do, because games have gotten so expensive. For me, I have never had that burden, and I've had success because of that and big failure because of that, but I've gotten to make exactly what I've wanted to make. And if I never make another game again and I leave this earth tomorrow, my children will be able to look at the output of games that I've directed or co-directed and say, my dad is in that. And there's no fucking doubt my dad is in that. And how can you complain about that?
The legacy Twisted Metal bears, defining a genre on its own against all odds, is something that will never burn out. From beginning to end, it screamed American creativity. He puts his soul into all of his work, but David has an especially soft spot for Twisted Metal and the people that love it. He feels a very deep connection with these fans in particular.
A lot of people associate me with God of War. But as much as I love God of War, Twisted Metal is closer to my spirit than God of War. Twisted Metal is the raw, aggressive, uncouth, unkempt, societally vulgar aspect of me that I adore. And when I meet other fans of Twisted Metal, even ones who haven't always agreed with the creative decisions I've made when I've worked on these titles, and they tell me that the series has meant a lot to them, whether it's because they've played it, growing up with their brother or their dads in split screen, or because the story's connected with them, or they think Sweet Tooth is one of the best slashers ever and he's such a badass serial killer and all that stuff. And I grew up loving Jason and Freddy and all that. There is an absolute sense of connection that I feel with the fans of Twisted Metal that I think is a deeper connection with the fans of God of War. I think there is a kinship and a brotherhood and a sisterhood where there's something about Twisted Metal fans that I think if someone did a study would say, oh, it's because all those people were kind of misfits back in high school, or all those people like a certain kind of music. I don't know what it is.
The series is far from perfect, but the rough and tumble feel of this sloppy combat is what made it so special. The last thing David and his crew wanted to do with these games was attempt to evaluate what would be the most financially viable creation, even when that was the initial intent. If it hinders their drive to make something special, if it hurts their creative freedom, then they don't want anything to do with it.
It's an American bar band is the way I look at Twisted Metal. And I wouldn't want it, give it to Insomniac and have them spend $120 million. It becomes slick and perfect. And it's not Twisted Metal at that point.
I'll even argue that it's how a lot of the Twisted Metal games can considerably show that video games are an art form. He didn't want to make the hotel painting of the industry that's so bland and vanilla flavored that it'll sell the most copies. He wanted to make something that he and his team can claim as their own, warts and all. That's basically the drive behind the best developers of the indie scene, a field in the industry that has bloomed tremendously in the past decade. Small teams pouring their heart and soul into a unique project, more interested in showing the world what they can do than sales. It's very clear why people like David Jaffe with his background loves this vibe so much more than what AAA game development has become.
I literally was in Walmart today waiting for my phone to get fixed next door, and I'm like, I'm going to walk around Walmart. I haven't been here in a while. And I go over to the game section, and I'm looking, and I'm not going to tell you what the games are, but I'm looking at a bunch of games, and some of these are big fucking games that have been marked down to $20. And I'm going, I don't want to play that. And I'm like, my God, what the fuck does it say about me and my taste these days that I'm not picking that game up right now, and they've marked it down for Christmas for $20 goddamn dollars. I would rather go home and play Project Warlock. I would rather go home and play Dusk, because these games have more heart and spirit, and that's what I like to play.
No matter how strange or crude some of these pieces are, all David wants is to point at his games, whether on the TV screen or store shelves, and go, this is me, this is my creation, I poured my identity into this game. That's what I look for in a game creator.
But I feel connected to the vast majority of them, and so the fact that anyone to this day is still interested in it, and that they've sat and listened to this and learned about things about Twisted Metal, and they've been a fan of it over the years, I just want to say on behalf of me and Scott and Kellen and Sony and Single Track and Eat, Sleep, Play, and all of us who've worked on them, Incognito, on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you to them. It's like meeting family members. We're appreciative.
Thank you so much for watching. Obviously, a big heartfelt thank you to David Jaffe, the man himself. I could not be grateful enough for him taking the time to discuss the Twisted Metal games with me, adding such a unique contribution to this video series, and of course for creating one of my favorite franchises of all time. Another big thanks to my patrons. You all help make these videos possible, and hope you enjoyed this retrospective series. A special shout out to a new czar of zombos. He goes by Gabriel Ball. And all I have to say to him is, serial number killing machine, the illest of means to an end built on the filthy sound you're experiencing. Yeah. It goes, 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 it goes. And to any newcomers that enjoyed this series, take a look at some of my older catalog in which I analyze games such as No More Heroes, Blazing Chrome, Dead Rising, and Lollipop Chainsaw.